co-conspirator, John Phelan, our Master of Ceremonies for this wonderful picnic, multi-generational picnic. We're so glad to see all of you here. Please take your seats, and I'll turn it over to John Phelan.
Mei Lin, thank you so much. So I am honored to be the cat herder today. This is a moment that we all take to kind of celebrate all the different contributions that have been made to the world that we live in today. And although we celebrate a particular milestone today with the kind of publication within IEEE transactions of the specification, this spawned a whole amazing amount of changes for the world that we live in. And as historians will tell you, this was an overnight success, at least 30 years in the making. So today we're going to hear from a bunch of different actors in this tale. And we know that there's more actors than there are on the stage today. And many of them are characters, as you also know. We also have talked about that there's a chance for the open mic to share your own stories and tales. And there's different ways that we're capturing the memories about what happened, what could have happened, what should have happened, and what this means next. But today, we're going to be here from multiple speakers around where things got started. And I asked each one of the speakers, if this hadn't happened, what would they have done? And so that'll be part of their introduction a little bit up front, pulling some things from the past. The first bout will be some folks more directly involved with TCP/IP. The second group will actually be speaking more about how they were influenced and involved in the overall process. And then, of course, the third group we're going to hear from is you yourselves. So feel free to sign up for the open mic, and we have a chance to share stories and tales along the way. With that, I'd like to introduce the man who needs no introduction, Vint Cerf. But I will say that in trying to figure out what he might have done differently along the way, we had a good chat ahead of time, but I also went to the scholarly works at google.com and dug up some of his early papers contemporaneously published at the same time with titles like Perry Meets the Doctor or Microprocessor Semaphore and a Graph Model of Computation. And so this could have gone any other different ways. I mean, from flag waving, for those of you who know Semaphore or old Boy Scouts or Navy people in the past, all the way to what we have today and spending quality time in a van with his closest friends. And so with that, Vint Cerf.
Thank you very much. I always get nervous when people clap before you've said anything, so it feels like I should just sit down because it won't get any better. Well, first of all, I want to thank Mei Lin and Bill Dahl and others, the volunteers, for actually organizing this. I mean, these chairs and the food and the glasses and everything, the programs and so on, didn't just happen. It takes a lot of work, and I really appreciate it. Second, I hope that you appreciate that this is intended to be a kind of a lightweight, very casual kind of celebration. I know I kind of screwed up by wearing a three-piece suit, but I have a rule now that I don't appear in public in anything but a three-piece suit because now it's kind of a trademark. Just tangentially, the reason that I wear three-piece suits is because when I was invited to leave Stanford University and come to the ARPA, the Advanced Research Projects Agency, my wife Sigrid said, we're going to Washington, D.C., you have to wear three-piece suits. So we went to Saks Fifth Avenue at Stanford Shopping Center. She bought three-piece suits, two of which were seersucker, because you know what it's like in July and August in Washington. So shortly after my arrival at ARPA, I had to give congressional testimony, and in the middle of the summer, so I wore a seersucker suit. And I did my thing, and I came back. And a couple of weeks later, I was asked to go up to the director's office on this question of the testimony. And I thought, oh, you know, God, did I say something wrong? And he said, no, we got a nice note from the chairman. He said that he appreciated your testimony. And by the way, he was the best-dressed person from ARPA he had ever seen. This positive feedback convinced me I should wear three-piece suits at all times in public. So here I am. I wanted also to convey to you Bob Connors regrets that he isn't here to enjoy the fine weather, good company, and reunions, but he sends his greetings, and he really appreciates the opportunity here to commemorate what is now a 40-year-old design. He and I spent 2 days at what is now the Crown Plaza Cabana Hotel, but back then it was the Hyatt Cabana, writing by hand the original design of the internet. And my secretary, my then secretary, Carolyn Tynai, who I wish were here, went to the trouble of typing all of this up. And she said, should I keep the written copy? And I said, no, it's easier to read your typed copy. We threw the written copy away. I can tell you I have been castigated no end by every historian who's come to grips with this question of retaining historical information. So for those of you who aren't sure whether you're doing something really profound, hang on to it anyway, just in case. I also feel compelled to recognize two people who have left us. John Postel is one of them, and Mike Moose is the other. And I'm sure there are others. Mike Padlitsky immediately comes to mind. Not everyone who's been part of this adventure is still with us, but we still remember their contributions. And I think that Postel especially was so central to the domain name system, internet address allocations, the RFC editing task. He was our internet assigned numbers authority, and his departure, his early and unexpected departure in 1998 really hurt. But he left a fantastic legacy. And Mike Moose also, who was at the Ballistic Research Laboratory, rescued us in several awkward technical moments. And so I have to say that both of them are well remembered, and I deeply personally appreciate all of their contributions. I thought it would be important to mention to you that this task of inventing the internet was not something that just two people did. Bob and I did, of course, write the first spec, but there were many, many people, not all of them from the US, who were part of the Stanford community and were part of a larger community called the International Network Working Group, which was patterned after the network working group that Steve Crocker started to do the NCP work and all of the host-to-host protocols and the applications on top of that for the predecessor ARPANET. And I frankly just copied that idea. There was this wonderful collaborative sense about all of the tasks that ARPA was pursuing at the time. The International Network Working Group included a number of people in Spain, in Europe, and also people in Asia, most notably in Japan. So when this first specification was written in September of 1973, Bob and I went to a meeting in London. It was actually in Sussex, University of Sussex. It was a NATO Advanced Studies Institute event, but during that event, the International Network Working Group convened, and I had an opportunity for the first time to present this design to that group. So I want to emphasize that much of the early work and the continuing work of internet was not only in the hands of people in the United States. So when people say the US invented the internet, they're not being fair to many other contributors around the world. I think also it's rather important to recognize how open the internet has been. The design was done in an open fashion, partly because it arose out of the academic world, and you know how we don't buy information from each other, we share information with each other, and that is what allows us to advance things so quickly. So openness has been a key part of the internet, and we need to keep it that way. And right now there's a lot of pressure to shut the internet down for political reasons. There's a lot of pressure to make the internet less open and accessible and providing users with choices for a variety of business reasons, and none of those should succeed. Our job is to keep the internet open, free, and growing so that it goes from the 3 billion people it reaches today to the 7 billion people that are on the planet. So I have just two other things that I wanted to draw to your attention. What's important about the internet is not its physical nature. I remind you that the ARPANET, the packet radio net, the packet satellite net, and the NSF net, four absolutely key parts of the early internet environment, are all gone now, but the internet survives, the internet persists, and it thrives. And the reason is that the internet is a design. It's a philosophy. It's an architecture. It's not just a bunch of wires, and in particular, it's certainly not a series of tubes. So it's really critical to keep that in mind. It is also not static. Some of you, I'm sure, are well aware of the IPv4 to IPv6 conversion that I've been preaching since 1996. You can all do me a favor, talk to your ISP and insist on what's the schedule for getting you your IPv6 address space. I want to know right here on the dotted line, when are you going to deliver? We need to get the ISPs to get on the stick because we have run out of IPv4 address space. You know why? We started with 32 bits. Bob and I were trying to figure out how big was this thing going to be? How many addresses did we have to have? And we had just, of course, finished having the ARPANET run for several years, 3 or 4 years. And so we thought, well, gee, a nationwide network is pretty expensive. So how many would there be per country? And we thought maybe 2, because we did want some competition. And then we said, how many countries are there? And we didn't know, and there wasn't any Google to ask. So we guessed 128 because that's a power of 2, and that's what programmers think about. So that was 256 networks. And then we thought, okay, so how many computers per network? And we thought we could be generous. How about 16 million, because that's 24 bits. That's a 32-bit number. And that looked like it would work okay. Of course, we ran out in February of 2011, and now we really, really need the 128-bit IPv6 address space. So anyway, let's get on the stick and make that happen. The last point I want to make before we go through everybody else's speeches and a wrap-up is I think of you and all the people who are not here but who have been part of this internet environment making up this gigantic, endless tapestry. Each one of us is a thread in that tapestry. Each one of us has contributed something to the internet's evolution, design, and continued use and growth. And so it's a rather pretty idea that so many people around the world can contribute to that continuing growth of tapestry. All the color, all the patterns, and everything else are part of the legacy of this design. So I'm really delighted to be around, frankly, to be able to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the design and the 30th or thereabouts anniversary of the operation of the internet, which was turned on January 1, 1983. So I'll stop there, and I'll turn this back over to our Master of Ceremonies. I look forward to hearing from everyone else.
Thank you, Vent. Most people consider 40 to be the start of going over the hill. I think the internet's actually accomplished more by 40 than most of us did. And yes, I'm over 40. So behind every brilliant professor, which Vent was at the time, professor, still brilliant, there are equally brilliant students who helped form the cohort of the research group. And Yogan was one of his students back in the day, in the early days of pulling all these pieces together. When I asked him about what he would have done differently, it's like, well, actually, Stanford was kind of a crazy place at the time. They didn't appreciate what we were doing. I probably would have ended up in like multiprocessor. So the semaphore piece I mentioned earlier, he would have been a co-author on that. So, Yoga, please come forward. Thank you.
Looking out at the audience and seeing so many familiar faces, just thinking to myself that 40 years can go by, yet some events seem just as clear as if they had happened yesterday. And what I wanted to say was that, for me, the most exciting thing that's happened in my career has been working on the design and specification of TCP as a graduate student. Now, I came here from India in September of 1972. And I think many of you know that Palo Alto, Stanford, Silicon Valley, and the greater Bay Area was a very different place. One might actually think of it as sleepy compared to what it is today. Yet, there's an incredible hotbed of innovation going on. Now, my fellow graduate students were busy trying to figure out how to put more transistors onto a chip or figure out how to really build multiprocessors, all the stuff that we now take for granted today. But I was fascinated by this thing that we called, in those days, that was called the ARPANET. And when you look back, I was living the future. I was sending emails, I was FTPing files, I was chatting with all kinds of other people that were connected to the ARPANET. So what we think of today as the World Wide Web really existed in a slightly different form that fostered collaboration way back in 1973. Now, one of my fondest memories is what I call the Alexander Graham Bell moment, when the TCP implementation that we were doing at Stanford on a PDP-11. I'm sure there are some of you in the audience who still remember what a PDP-11 was. It was the mini computer that was the hottest piece of equipment that you could get in those days. The Computer History Museum certainly has some of those. Was communicating with the TCP built at BBN on a PDP-10 running 10x. Now, 10x in those days was a state-of-the-art operating system. It was the best thing you could possibly get. And so when that happened, we were all jumping for joy because we'd spent many, sleepless nights and, of course, days programming TCP in a programming language called BCPL. And I think some of you have used that language. It was a precursor to C. So when you go back and look at what happened in those days, it was a different environment, but the innovation that was taking place was still as hot as it is today. Now, after that particular experiment, we discovered that there were a couple of things in TCP that weren't working right, and so we went back to work and tried to create a more robust version of TCP. And so in the sort of November, December of 1974, I was busily typing from handwritten notes, drafts by Vint, Carl Sunshine, and myself, racing to get the spec done by the end of the year. And again, for those of you who remember, I was using a state-of-the-art TI Silent 700 thermal printer terminal. So this was awesome because, instead of having dot matrix, you could just get these pages flying out of your terminal with various drafts. And again, going back into the past, I was using what Doug Engelbart and his group at SRI, there's many of you here, were building, which was then called NLS for online system, using the word processor and hierarchical editing system. So you just have to go back and realize that, for me at least, this was sort of a most unique experience in my life that has certainly impacted what I've done since then. Now later on, after getting my PhD from Stanford, I went over to Xerox, and that's where my eyes got opened up because there were Altos there and there were Ethernets, and what we thought of as internetworking was going to happen at a very different scale. And I know John Schock is going to give you some of his perspectives of what happened in those days, but in 1978, we persuaded Vint and then the larger TCP community that was growing that they should take TCP and split it into TCP and IP. And that's why today it's called TCP over IP. So just in my final comments are that I met Vint in January of 1973. Vint was teaching a class on systems programming, and I didn't know anything about systems programming, and I was sort of busy learning all this stuff. And I went up to him after that and said that I was quite fascinated by the work that he was doing on networking in general, especially derivatives from the ARPANET. And that particular encounter really has changed the arc of my life. And it's something that I treasure very much because it's really, helped define who I am today. And I had no idea when I came in '72 that any of this stuff was possible. And TCP/IP really, at the end of the day, I think of it as the internal combustion engine of the information age. It's in every single device in order to make this worldwide connectivity happen, whether it's on a wearable computer or an embedded machine or the iPhone or Android device that you're carrying with you. So thank you, Vint.
Thank you very much.
Turns out academically, the apple did not fall very far from the tree, did it? Sorry, that was really bad.
-2.
-2. Need a hook for myself. Anyway, so next up, Dan Lynch is going to share a few things about the importance of any protocol, any new invention, any new standard needs a customer. And Dan was at SRI at the time when all these pieces started to come together. When I asked him the question of, if not this, then what? He says, well, I was having a bit of a midlife crisis. I was trying to find and get funding for a cheap and fast Lisp machine. And very few, probably most people in the audience have never programmed in Lisp or even know what I'm talking about. But Luke's waving his arm and says, yes, he has. And those of you who went to school on the other coast, and I mentioned 001, you do know what I mean by Lisp. But that's a very small group out here as well. Anyway, with that, Dan Lynch, please come forward.
Yeah, thanks, John. I was at SRI. I got there in April of '73, and to run their computer lab for their artificial intelligence center, hence the Lisp, idea. But so I was the boiler room operator for boiler room designers. And so I'm doing this and having a blast doing it, and running on this 10x system that we got from BBN in Boston, and, and things are going along fine. And then this buddy of mine named Bill Plummer, who was back at BBN then, he was doing something. He'd written the FTP, the Fault Transfer Protocol specification earlier, and so that's how I got to know him. And then he said he was debugging this thing called TCP, and they were doing it inside the BBN amongst two computers inside BBN, but they'd like to throw it across the country and see how it broke, and would I, participate? And I said, sure, why not? I wasn't paid to do that. I mean, actually, most of us weren't paid to do whatever we really did. We were paid to do something else, and then we found something fun to do, and that's what I found. And so I started debugging this stuff in this BCPL, like, what the heck is that? And because it was funny, you wrote it in that language, but when you debugged, it was assembler, and you're dealing with a bare machine and no real-time editors or debuggers or anything like that. Our debugger was a core dump, and then pawing through that to figure out what the heck went wrong. And my memory in the early days was, we had no idea how many buffers to have inside the computer or anything like that. We heard about this retransmission. You're going to have to hold on to stuff until you get an acknowledgement that, all that jazz. And we thought, well, how many buffers do you have? We had no idea, I mean, you only have as much as you have real physical memory in those days. And so anyway, so